During World War II, Japan committed some of the most heinous atrocities in modern history. The list is endless: executions of civilians thrown into mass graves, injection of diseases and plagues into prisoners of war, massive rapes, and impalement of infants. Lack of scruples and contempt for human life were part of the imperial ideology. Fortunately, the Axis was defeated, and its leaders had to answer to international law. Due to Japanese savagery, the Allies decided to conduct an unprecedented process in the heart of the archipelago, the Tokyo Trials. For almost 3 years, hundreds of brutal crimes were reviewed, resulting in executions and severe penalties, but also giving rise to controversies that are still being debated today. In this installment of military history, we invite you to one of the most important events of the post-war period, to learn how the atrocities of Imperial Japan were paid for. In the midst of World War II, Allied leaders Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin issued a proclamation that was fundamental to history. In that document, they announced that when the conflict ended, all military leaders of the Axis would be judged for their crimes. The determination was reaffirmed during the Tehran Conference in 1943, the Yalta Conference in 1945, and the Potsdam Conference later that same year. Once the war in Asia ended on August 15, 1945, the United States Army occupied the entirety of Japan and a large part of the country's former Asian colonies. From that moment on, the persecution and detention of high-ranking members of the Japanese government and military, guilty of some of the most harrowing atrocities of the time, began. The Allies knew that the archipelago had acted brutally, which is why, parallel to the Nuremberg trials, an international military tribunal for the Far East was established. The aim was to judge the accused of crimes outlined in a document known as the London Charter. The Tokyo War Academy was chosen as the venue for the trials because it was one of the few buildings still standing at the end of the conflict.
Mr. President, the witnesses in court will now be sworn. You are now called to testify as a witness in this case now before the tribunal. And you have a duty to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
So began the process, presenting one of the hundreds of witnesses of the massacre. Before delving into this aspect, let's first talk about the composition of that jury. The tribunal was composed of a panel of judges appointed by the victorious countries of the war. It was clear that, along with the conflict, the Allies had also earned the right to write history, and that meant judging the crimes of the enemy. The participating countries were the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, China, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines. The significant presence of Asian nations is because many of them were the ones who suffered from the activities of the Japanese Imperial Army. The prosecution was led by the American Joseph Keenan, and it included prosecutors from all the countries that appointed judges to the tribunal. On August 8, 1945, work began, but it took almost a year to gather the necessary documents, apprehend the accused, and build a solid case. During the last months of 1945, members of both defense and prosecution worked against the clock to support their positions with evidence. The eerie fact is that the victims' corpses were still fresh. The thousands of graves and detention centers set up by Japan were near urban areas and were easily accessible to investigators. Later, we will detail what kind of atrocities occurred within their walls. Let's listen to the testimonies of a Chinese citizen who remembered the treatment received by their women.
Some interpreters forced over 40 Chinese women into an open square and there compelled them to undress under threats of bayonets and to walk around in full view of the wrestlers, who were required to kneel on the ground and witness the scene. If a spectator diverted his eyes, he would be struck with a rifle butt. The Japanese soldiers laughed and clapped their hands.
On May 3, 1946, the team of prosecutors led by Keenan presented the indictments, holding several Japanese officials, generals, and leaders responsible for misdeeds against peace, which broke with the war crimes treaties signed prior to the conflict. The volume of the documents was so large that it took several weeks to complete the reading and presentation of the facts, each with a morbid wealth of detail. Once this first part was finalized, it was time for the long and tortuous debate on the responsibilities and the appropriate sentences for each accused. In total, the Tokyo trials lasted more than 2.5 years, and the testimonies of 419 witnesses were heard, with a total of 4,236 pieces of evidence, including contributions from almost 800 specialists. It was the longest and most complex judicial process carried out in Asia, the first of its kind, both for the number of people who participated and for the nature of the crimes being evaluated. From mass massacres carried out in China, in the various concentration camps established by the empire in the Manchuria area, to the mistreatment and execution of prisoners of war. The latter was one of the central points, since captured soldiers who did not resist being captured must be treated humanely. However, within Japanese prisons that word did not exist. Starvation and beatings were the most frequent, to the point of beating dozens of Americans and Chinese to death with clubs. Below, we will see material recorded during the liberation of Uncle Sam's soldiers. The soldier's smile is that of a man tasting food and cigarettes for the first time in months. Testimonies account for meager rations of just 1 bowl of rice per day. Much of the brutality exercised by Japan was uncovered during this long and torturous trial. For example, the sinister work of the buntai-jo, a kind of captains within the Japanese prison system. These individuals were in charge of handling prisoners of war, and they were the ones who frequently inflicted the most bloody tortures and punishments on the prison population. The incredible thing is that they didn't limit themselves to beating and starving, but they applied imagination to increase the pain of their victims. In their repertoire were methods such as forcing prisoners to consume liters of water to the brink of suffocation, and then crushing the abdomen by having a person jump on them. This caused vomiting, bleeding, and irreparable damage to the stomach tract. According to the findings of the Tokyo Tribunal, the mortality rate among prisoners of war from the Asian countries invaded by Japan was 27%. Beyond this general data, there was a fundamental fact involving Emperor Hirohito. The leader lifted restrictions mandated by international law on the treatment of detainees of Chinese origin. The decision was ratified on August 5, 1937, and it gave carte blanche to Japanese torturers to eliminate prisoners from China. This is why only 56 prisoners of war from that country were released after Japan's surrender. Annihilation was practically total. Rudolf Joseph Rummel, a professor of political science at the University of Hawaii, maintains that between 1937 and 1945, the Japanese army murdered between 3 and 10 million people. Within that figure were approximately 6 million Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, and Indo-Chinese. Nationality is not a minor detail, as one of the main driving forces behind Japanese crimes was a racial ideology quite similar to that propagated by Nazism. The Japanese Empire instilled in its population the belief in an innate superiority, asserting that the domination of Asia was not only a possibility, but a right for the supreme nation of the region. From this perspective, other populations were little more than animals deserving the worst treatment. It didn't matter if these conquests meant shooting thousands of people, raping their wives, and murdering their children. Dominating the area was Japan's manifest destiny, and they used all their power to achieve it. After World War II, cases of torture and human experimentation within special Japanese units were revealed. The infamous Unit 731 used pathogens and diseases that were injected into Chinese prisoners in the Manchurian region, with the aim of seeing the results in the human body. Although it is not strictly the use of chemical weapons, which is severely regulated by international law, it is an inhumane procedure that aims to implement viruses and plagues as a tool of destruction. The incredible thing is that these crimes were not included in the Tokyo trial. which is surprising since these are some of the most atrocious activities of the entire conflict. It is like not judging what happened in Auschwitz during the Nuremberg trials. A striking similarity between the trials carried out in Germany and Japan is that in both cases the leaders of the countries could not be prosecuted. On the one hand, Adolf Hitler committed in his bunker, avoiding falling into the hands of Allied justice. On the other hand, Emperor Hirohito was exempt from appearing before the law, but for a radically different reason. The Allies, led by the American General Douglas MacArthur, argued that executing the emperor would make it impossible to recompose relations with the archipelago. Japan was a promising nation, and Washington was well aware that the world of the future included a constant presence in that enclave in the heart of the Pacific. In order to carry out this strategy, some concessions were necessary, such as sparing Hirohito's life, avoiding the maximum humiliation of the empire. But not all Japanese leaders suffered the same fate. Others had to resort to desperate tactics to avoid embarrassment. Many of the accused Japanese officials preferred to commit suicide rather than be arrested and tried in front of the eyes of the world. For example, General Korichika Anami, Minister of War, chose to atone for his great guilt by resorting to seppuku, the Japanese ritual. The practice consists of cutting one's abdomen with a special knife in a specific position and is the only way to regain one's honor before dying. On the other hand, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the creator of the kamikaze pilots, ended his life after failing to honor either his people or his emperor after the defeat against the Allies. His influence during the last part of the war was immeasurable. Due to his orders, images such as those we will see below occurred. In an incredible twist of fate, Onishi ended his own life, in the same way that hundreds of kamikaze pilots died by crashing into enemy ships. These men gave their lives in the service of Japan, for leaders who had no qualms about sacrificing their people in exchange for perpetuating a conflict that had already been lost. Hideki Tojo had been Japan's prime minister in the war, and was considered by both sides to be the architect of the conflicts in the Pacific. The man understood that if he committed suicide, he would take full credit for the failure and defeat against the enemy. In this way, he would avoid dishonoring the imperial family and other important figures in Japan. After the arrival of the American military police at his house, and once his credentials were checked, Tojo retired to his rooms, took a pistol he kept for that purpose, and shot himself in the chest above the heart. After several hours of waiting for an American doctor, and after having his wound sutured, Tojo survived because he did not shoot himself accurately. During his trial, one of the strangest moments of the trial occurred.
One of them is the bald-headed would-be suicide, General Tojo. Another is Dr. Shumei Okawa, sitting just behind him. Watch. Perhaps he found it irresistible. Perhaps he just doesn't like Tojo.
Shumei Okawa, a famous pro-nationalist Japanese intellectual, patted Tojo's bald head, eliciting a smile from the war minister. The reason for this action is not known, but Okawa was later acquitted of charges for not being mentally fit, as he suffered various nervous breakdowns during the trial. Beyond this comedic pause, the process continued until the final resolution. Between 1946 and 1948, Australian Representative Sir William Flood Webb was tasked with leading the 417 sessions that would conclude with 7 death sentences, 6 life imprisonments, 1 20-year sentence, and another of 7 years. Those sentenced to hang were influential generals during the campaign: Kenji Doihara, Koki Hirota, Seishiro Itagaki, Heitaro Kimura, Akira Muto, and the aforementioned Hideki Tojo. Executions were scheduled for November 25th, but were suspended because defense lawyers filed an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the entire population of Japan awaited the outcome of this historic trial. After reviewing the appeal, the Supreme Court announced its decision on December 20th with a concise statement: General MacArthur has been chosen and acts as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. the military tribunal has been established by General MacArthur as the executive organ of the Allied forces. Therefore, the Supreme Court of the United States has no power or authority to review, confirm, reject, or annul the sentence. Hence, the petition is dismissed. The criminals were about to feel the noose tightening around their necks.
The tribunal finds Tojo guilty under count 54.
And sentences to death by hanging the man who suicidally led Japan to stab America in the back.
Thus, after the appeal was rejected, the 7 condemned to the gallows spent their last days of life in Sugamo prison, calm and resigned to their fate. On the eve of the execution, set for midnight on December 22, 1948, the accused requested to speak with a Buddhist priest and wrote letters to their families. At 11:40 p.m. on December 22nd, an American officer accompanied by an armed escort awakened the 7 condemned who, after attending a brief religious service, were led to the gallows accompanied by the Buddhist priest and a prison chaplain. The first group of condemned entered the so-called death chamber, where in the center, brightly lit, awaited a platform on which 5 gallows had been erected. Hideki Tojo, who was the first accused to ascend to the gallows, refused American military rations and requested traditional Japanese dishes, clinging until the last moment to his culture. Tojo approached the scaffold wearing a faded Army auxiliary uniform, without ranks or decorations. Once the 4 accused were hooded, the silence was broken by an unexpected shout of "Banzai!", a war cry of Japanese soldiers. The 4 trapdoors opened simultaneously. After the execution, the bodies were loaded onto military police trucks and taken to the Kubayama crematorium. The ashes were moved to a secret location, and newspapers published a poem that Tojo had dictated before his death. "Farewell to all. Today I will cross the earthly mountains and joyfully enter the fields of Buddha." Very serene words for the person responsible for countless atrocities. In addition to those sentenced to death, all major figures of the Japanese army, lesser sentences were also handed down to thousands of soldiers. These trials were conducted at various points across the Pacific, and some lasted until 1951. However, most of these criminals received minimal punishments that in many cases were not even served. After the executions, and to ease tension between the different representatives of the accused and the prosecutors, a member of the defense stated that peace had to reign among the peoples. The United States had to forget Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, Japan is its main military partner in the Pacific and home to the 7th Fleet of the Navy. The debate about the legality and objectives of the Tokyo trials began from the outset. One of the main points of objection was that both the judges and the prosecutors belonged to the same side, undermining the objectivity of the trial's outcome. Furthermore, a much-discussed factor was the exclusion of some of the most dangerous and demented perpetrators, such as those operating Unit 731 or Emperor Hirohito himself. We would like you to be part of this debate. Do you believe the Tokyo trials were adequate and up to the atrocities committed? Leave us your answer in the comments box. Nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, the atrocities that occurred during that period are still a subject of study. How to confront those sins is a question that still has no answer. In this way, we come to the end of the video. If you like this type of content, we recommend subscribing and activating notifications for our channel. Without further ado, we bid you farewell until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.